Eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, adder's fork and blindworm's sting, lizard's leg and an owl's wing, for a charm of powerful trouble, like a hell broth boil and bubble, double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Welcome to Monster Month ISWUTT episode number 3. Thank you very much for joining me on this spellbinding journey of an episode. My name is Michael Graham, and I will be your host for this third installment of Monster Month here on the ISWUTT podcast. Now, before I begin, I'd like to take a moment and ask you to please go follow me on social media. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at ISWUTT Podcast. That is ISWUTT Podcast. Facebook.com/ISWUTT Podcast. And if you really like what I'm doing here and you enjoy listening to the show, you can go to anchor.fm/ISWUTT. That is anchor.fm/ISWUTT. And you can submit a donation. All of the donations that are given to the show are going to go directly towards assisting me in providing with the best possible content in the future. And the way I'll do that is by getting a new mixing board, getting some microphones, having guests on, and ultimately getting a mini fridge so we can have some icy cold potions. Now let's get into it. So from 1692, 1693, there was a mass hysteria that swept through a small town, a small village in New England, known today as Danvers, Massachusetts. The events that occurred in this village, which is called Salem, are a chilling reminder of what a mass hysteria can do to a group of people, especially those people living in a small and relatively remote, isolated village. This hysteria found more than 200 people being accused and 30 of them being found guilty. So keep in mind, isolationism, religious extremism, false accusations, and really an overall lapse in due process are things that contributed to this hysteria. Now, out of the 30 people that were found guilty, 19 were sentenced to be hanged publicly. One person was pressed to death by large stones, and more than 5 people died while just sitting and rotting away in prison. Now, what was this hysteria, you may ask? Was it a plot for murder? Was it a plot to overthrow the local governments? I mean, the punishments certainly seem to fit those types of accusations, but no. This hysteria and the accusations that laid at the feet of more than 200 people were that of witchcraft. The village, Salem Village in colonial Massachusetts. In February of 1692, there were 2 young ladies by the name of Betty Paris and her cousin Abigail Williams, both at the time ages 9 and 11, began to experience, I guess you would call them fits, that were described as fits beyond the power of epileptic seizures, beyond the power of natural disease, to affect fits of the devil, claimed by John Hale, who is a minister in the nearby town of Beverly, Massachusetts. And now these fits might not have caused such a stir except for the fact that the 2 girls here in question, Betty and Abigail, ages 9 and 11, were the daughter and the niece of the local Reverend Samuel Paris. Now, during these episodes, these 2 girls seemed to lose all control. They started speaking gibberish and throwing things, crawling on all fours and contorting their bodies into odd shapes that you normally wouldn't find someone in. And when these fits were all done, these 2 girls complained that they were constantly being pinched or poked with pins, or almost like somebody walked up and just pinched them. And when the local doctor gave them an inspection, there was no pinpricks, there were no physical markings, so nothing seemed to be physically wrong with the two girls. Realistically, this odd behavior most likely became due because of the fact that the winter of 1692 was brutal. It was one of the coldest and longest that were on record. And honestly, these two girls were probably just going a little bit stir crazy because of the brutal conditions and being kind of cooped up in their small, very basic homes at the time. But the locals decided to look into what was causing these fits of almost possession. And once the investigation began, the logical conclusion surfaced, and it was deemed that the girls were just sick. They had a fever, and they just rested until the fever was gone, and then that was it. Just kidding. Instead of going with any type of a logical conclusion here, the investigation led initially to 3 women being accused of witchcraft. Now, the 3 that were accused, one was by the name of Sarah Good, the other Sarah Osborne, and one went simply by the name of Tituba, who Tituba was a South American slave that was actually owned by the Reverend Samuel Parris, whose daughter was just bewitched and possessed. Now, there's some speculation as to why these 3 women really were the ones that were accused. Realistically, it was commonly thought that Sarah Good was singled out because she had a reputation for, I guess you would say, turning away the ideals of the church and not necessarily conforming with the way that all of the Puritans lived their lives. And Sarah Osborne was also accused because she rarely attended church. And she was kind of seen as a less than reputable figure because she tried to control the inheritance that was being given from her then deceased husband down to one of their heirs. So it kind of showed to the locals that she had only her own interest in mind, and she would really do anything to try to come out on top, no matter what that took. And Tituba, realistically, came to be accused simply because of her ethnicity. She would regularly tell tales from her home, the West Indies, to the young girls that were living in the town. And these stories often told of sexual encounters with demons, using men strictly for lust and telling fortunes. And this made these young girls who would hear these stories, their minds would run wild. And because of those stories being told to these young people in the town, it made Tituba a very obvious target for these accusations of witchcraft. And each of these 3 women were in some way considered outcasts in this village, which led them to be nearly defenseless while facing their accusers. So all 3 of these women were then brought in front of local magistrates and were subjected to multiple days of interrogations. Now, during this interrogation, Tituba eventually confessed to worshiping the devil and the practice of witchcraft, which she had claimed the 2 other women, Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good, forced her to begin. So they forced her into almost this witch's coven. And after the interrogations concluded on March 1st of 1692, the women were all sent to jail for an undetermined amount of time. Now, once this precedent was set, more and more accusations began to come to light in this small village. But not all of those that were accused were necessarily labeled as outcasts or rebels in their local societies. 2 examples of this would be 2 ladies by the name of Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse, who by all means were seen as good and upstanding, church-going, God-fearing individuals. They never stepped out of line from a societal standpoint, and yet they still stood accused. So if these 2 women could stand accused of witchcraft and questioned by the local authorities, who could be exempt from this? While the accusations began to fly, at least we knew one thing. Young children that lived in the area were safe from being a part of this mayhem, this mass hysteria at first. Now, Dorothy Good, the daughter of Sarah Good, one of the initial 3 to be accused of witchcraft. Her daughter was 4 years old. The 4-year-old Dorothy Good was placed in jail and questioned by the local magistrates. And the answers that this 4-year-old girl, Dorothy, gave to the line of questioning were used to craft almost what would be a confession that her mother was indeed a witch. So because of this false confession, and I'm sure the questioning was incredibly pointed to this 4-year-old girl to get the answers that the locals wanted to hear, to continue this literal witch hunt. So this 4-year-old girl gave the answers that they wanted to hear, and her mother was then solidified as a witch. Now, while in prison, Dorothy Good's mother, Sarah, was with child. She was pregnant at the time when she got arrested, so while she was in prison, she gave birth to a baby. And quickly, unfortunately, the child passed from this earth. And once her newborn was deceased, Sarah Good was quickly convicted and hanged publicly in front of the rest of the town. Now, even those that were living in nearby towns weren't safe from these accusations. There was a woman by the name of Rachel Clinton who lived in the nearby town of Ipswich, and she was arrested on charges of witchcraft that were completely independent of what had been going on in Salem. She was not accused of being a party to this witchcraft going on in Salem, had nothing to do with the accusations, but for some reason, they decided to choose her and point her out and say, you are indeed a witch as well, so you will be accused and stand trial, and she was shortly after arrested. Now, as more and more people began to be accused of witchcraft, there was a feeling of unease and nervousness that grew within Salem. And a majority of these accusations were nearly baseless, and they're believed to stem from really what was a well-known feud between 2 families at the time. And the 2 families in question were the Porters and the Putnams. So it was known that these 2 families did not get along, and almost everybody living in Salem at the time may not have been a part of one of these 2 families, but they all had an allegiance to one or the other, whether it be through means of a small social circle, church affiliations, working with an individual who's a part of that family, so now you are on their side of this rivalry. And it seemed the easiest way to remove your rival is to simply accuse them of being a witch or a warlock and let the township do the rest. Put them in jail. If someone is standing in your way, let's say you wanted to get more work and you wanted to have more income to bring to your family. Maybe you wanted to bring more food home, and someone is taking your share, someone is taking your work. Maybe someone is even surpassing you in local reputation. The quickest way to do away with that individual would be to simply accuse them of being a witch, of being a warlock, a wizard. And these accusations were brought upon members of the community for, and in air quotes, I'm going to say crimes of things as small as looking at a neighbor in a strange way. If the cow that you had suddenly got sick or was producing sour milk, well, someone must have cursed it. So you had best figure out who done it and accuse them. If you heard your neighbor whispering, it could have been assumed that they were whispering and trying to use a spell under their breath. Even if you did nothing at all, you could still be accused, because one of these accusations of being haunted by a local witch or warlock, you could bring what they called spectral evidence to the courts and to the table, and you could say, well, I know that someone is attacking me that is a witch because there are spirits that only I can see that are haunting me, and they were sent by the person that I intend to accuse. So you could even be doing nothing at this point, minding your own business, just trying to be a productive member of society, a good individual, church-going, God-fearing, and automatically you can be accused of being a party to this witchcraft, this wizardry. So it didn't seem necessarily like the best place to be, unless you are into witchcraft. Then in that case, might as well hang out with all these witches. Seems like a pretty cool thing. So what eventually happened with these accusations, it came down to the members of Salem and surrounding villages realizing what was going on, and they were starting to accuse others before the other could accuse them of being a witch or a wizard. So if you were indeed on the sour end of being accused of witchcraft, and you decided to stand by your innocence. I did not do this. I was not a witch. I was not a wizard. I had nothing to do with it. I was minding my own business. This is a baseless accusation. Then you would face a certain death by standing by your morals, saying you did nothing wrong. However, if you confessed and you would repent, you could then be forgiven, as long as you're willing to name the person that inducted you into this witchcraft. So the question is, would you act in an honest fashion and deny that you or your neighbors or friends or family were a party to this witchcraft and this worship of the devil and dealings with demons? Or do you lie to try to save your own ass, literally, and admit to it, and then knowingly sentence someone else in your community who may have been a colleague, may at one point have been a friend, certainly a friend of friend. This wasn't a very big town, but you would be knowingly falsely accusing someone to a possible public execution. And a majority of the time, the townsfolk that sat on these juries that were overseeing these witch trials were indeed relatives of the accusers. So now that would certainly be considered a conflict of interest in terms of today's standards. But then these families would just look out for one another and what was in the best interest of the person that they held more near and dear to their own heart. So while the members of these villages, Salem and surrounding areas, they knew this system was way out of whack, but no one would speak up. In fact, there was a judge by the name of Nathaniel Saltonstall who pointed out the flaws of what was going on with this literal witch hunt, with these accusations, with this trial process. But as soon as he mentioned that there are incredible flaws in what is going on here, he was immediately targeted as a prime suspect for witchcraft. Now, while Saltonstall never was formally accused, the rumor had spread with everyone that he very much was in cahoots with these witches, and that's why he's trying to bring up these incredible flaws in the system so that way he could help aid those who are witches. So he was never formally charged, but in the public eye, he certainly was guilty of being a wizard or a warlock, if you will. And because the public did not see him as an upstanding part of their society, how could he carry on as a judge, an impartial member of law enforcement that can give down sentencing that has no sway one way or the other? So he was actually pressured so heavily by the locals that he had to resign from his role as a judge. And he did so formally on June 8th of 1692. So just a few months after these witch trials started and this literal witch hunt started, he had to step down because people didn't necessarily see him in the best light because he was not conforming to this hysteria. By spring of 1963, a little over a year since everything had begun, over 100 people had been imprisoned for a short period of time, and even more were imprisoned for more lengthy sentences. So at this time in spring of 1693, 14 of the accused women were executed publicly by hanging, and 6 men were also executed in the same fashion. Now, it all came to a conclusion eventually in 1693, May specifically of 1693, when the governor of the Massachusetts colony by the name of Sir William Phips put a swift end to these trials, to these accusations, to the imprisonment of anybody accused. And, you might sit there and think, well, after this has been going on for over a year, what caused this governor of Massachusetts colony, William Phips, to put such a quick end to this? Well, it was because his own wife was accused of being a witch. And at this point, as soon as his wife was accused, Governor Phips put an end to this very quickly. And he said, no, we are not doing this anymore. Enough is enough. I've let this run rampant in the area for long enough, instilling this fear, this hysteria. No more. He put an end to the trials. And he actually had released 49 out of the 52 still accused that were imprisoned. So, once again, in May of 1693, everybody who stood accused, he pardoned all of them. And in the following months, the governor of Massachusetts had to be proactive in dropping everything in terms of these witch trials. Because on a few different occasions, there would be pockets of rumors that someone was still a witch and someone is still doing this and that. So there would be discussion of bringing back these trials, and he would put an end to that very, very quickly. So over the greater part of the next year, he actually had to stay very, very proactive, and he had to stay paying attention to what everybody is saying all around the colony, because the last thing that he wanted was for more trials to come after he had so publicly put an end to it. If he publicly stands there and says, this is no longer happening, enough is enough, everyone is pardoned, and then it starts happening again, then his leadership would come into question. And he would be very quickly removed as the governor of a colony. So he was damn sure not to let this happen any longer. And that was really the end of these witch trials in the New World, as they called it at the time, in 1693. So I do have a list here. And this is a list of all of those who were indeed hanged, and they met their demise because of these witch trials. So we can start in June of 1692. You have Bridget Bishop. In July, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds were all publicly hanged from a tree. August brought George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, John Willard, George Jacobs Sr., John Proctor, the doctor, all hanged in August. September brought Martha Corey, who was mentioned earlier as one of the ladies who was an incredibly upstanding citizen, was indeed publicly hanged because she stood by her innocence. Mary Easty and Pudiator, I don't think I'd said that one correctly, but forgive me. Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Wilmot Red, Margaret Scott, and Samuel Wardwell, all on the same day, September 22nd. All 8 of them hanged on the same day. And in fact, one individual who was deemed to be, I guess, a wizard, warlock, a male witch, he decided not to plead guilty and also not to say he was not guilty. So he just failed to put in any plea at all. His name was Giles Corey. And instead of being hanged, he was crushed to death by boulders. So they laid him down by the river on top of a wooden slat. They placed another wooden slat on his face. He was laying face up. And they would add one boulder after the next, after the next, after the next, until the weight was too much for his physical body to bear, and he was crushed slowly. Terrible. And if you think that is all, the final thing of note with these witch trials, with this witch hunt, is that during this time, 2 dogs were put to death because the dogs were accused of being witches. Remember that. 2 dogs accused of being doggy witches. And that is the harrowing tale, the spellbinding tale of the Salem witch trials. And it goes to show you, once again, how being overly isolated, blindly following what your church is telling you, what your fellow society members are telling you, can be an incredibly dangerous thing, especially when completely throwing out the idea of due process and just going along with the crowd and joining in the hysteria. How dangerous that can be. It can lead to people dying. In this case, it led to a lot of people dying and a lot of people being accused, reputations ruined, families torn apart, an entire village at odds with one another, when realistically they should be getting along and they should band together because of other forces that were trying to put an end to them, whether it be attacks from the French military, whether it be attacks from the natives. In the moment, they had infighting, and that made them incredibly weak for a short period of time. Fortunately, the people that lived in the colony of Massachusetts did indeed survive and eventually thrive. But keep that in mind, mass hysteria can be a very real thing, and it can have some very, very dire consequences. So with that, I'll say what's up to that. Thank you very much for joining me, and we'll catch you next time on Monster Month.